You know what that means? It's time for Explain and Verify. President Cyril Ramaphosa in his weekly letter made a call for the nation to challenge what he called the completely false narrative that our country is a place in which people of a certain race or culture are being targeted or prosecuted. Today, we'll explain and verify the wealth inequality, income inequality, and employment and that is skewed along racial lines in South Africa. Here's Samgele.
Well, Bongiwe, not to confuse many people, particularly after that court judgment at the Constitutional Court with that appeal being declined there. You have to excuse the tie that I am wearing today. But South Africa is, by most contemporary measures, the most unequal country in the world, as per the World Bank in 2022. According to the Southern Africa Labour and Development Research Unit at the University of Cape Town, in general, white households have greater maiden wealth compared to black households across the income distribution. The report further stated that this is a clear legacy of colonialism and apartheid, where minority rule was premised on racially motivated exclusion of the majority from ownership and participation in the economy. So one wonders what those gentlemen crisscrossing America from South Africa, what they are complaining about. Looking at our very first graphic, Bongiwe, which further explains the wealth inequality in South Africa. Wealth inequality in South Africa. I hope AfriForum is watching, by the way. The top 10% of people own 86% of the aggregate wealth. The top 10% of people own 86% of the aggregate wealth. That is primarily, if you look at South Africa's economic landscape, the tiny fractional white minority that controls the South African economy. The top 0.01% of people own about 15% of all of the wealth in SA. The top 0.01% of people own about 15% of all of the wealth in SA. The top 0.1% own 25% of the wealth. The net wealth of the top 1% of people is 17.8 million rands. So the top 1%, each and every individual in the top 1% is worth 17.8 million rands. The bottom 50% of people own assets of about 16,000 rands. The bottom 50% of people own assets of about 16,000 rands. That is clear as daylight that is speaking about which particular demographic and which race within the country. A typical black household in the top income group has just below 30% of the wealth of a typical white household. Let's repeat for those crisscrossing, complaining about genocide against a particular demographic within the country. A typical black household in the top income group has just below 30% of the wealth of a typical white household.
So, Samgele, I think what's important there, right, to state is that the statistics you just presented is in all forms of assets at the top end, including housing, pension funds, and other financial assets. So, how is the country doing when it comes to top management in the corporate world?
Well, Bongiwe, in the top management in the corporate world, your JSE-listed companies, your Standard Banks, your ABSAs. In fact, in ABSA, they've just acquired a senior executive from Standard Bank, which is largely male, fighting amongst themselves for those executive positions, largely in the hands of the white minority. According to the Department of Employment and Labour's annual 2023 Employment Equity Report, in corporate South Africa, white individuals occupy 62% of top management positions, while 17% of leadership roles are led and held by black managers. So African and females in general have less been represented compared to the white population group and the male gender counterpart. This leads us to look at the income distribution in our next slide, Mungiwe. The income distribution in South Africa, percentage of population. The income distribution is highly skewed. The income distribution is highly skewed, not only between whites and blacks, but also between male and female counterparts. For instance, a CEO who is black and female will earn way less than a white male who is a CEO of a corporate entity, either listed in the JSE, multinational, conglomerate, but that black CEO who's male and who's either also female black will earn less than their white counterpart. The top 20% of the population holds over 68% of the income, maiden of 47% for similar emerging markets. The top 20% of the population holds over 68% of the income. This just brings me to one issue of one company that is within the food industry. That particular CEO who had a salary increase in a year that the company did not do well and was white and was male. And you look at other CEOs, particularly within that particular space, within those multinational companies that earn millions and millions of rands compared to their other counterparts. And you'd remember one CEO, when the black CEO of one bank in the country, when his salary was published, they asked, what if he was white and male? What would his salary be, as people were complaining about that particular black CEO at the time? The bottom 40% of the population holds 7% of the income. The bottom 40% of the population holds 7% of the income. So you look at the skewedness of the salary discrepancy within the country. The top 20% of the population holds 68% of the income, Bongiwe. The bottom 40% of the population holds 7% of the income, compared to the 16% for other emerging markets.
And you look at the fact that black South Africans, right, comprise 80% of the population, but we understand they are mostly affected by unemployment. What do the numbers tell us?
Well, Bongiwe, the unemployment rate among black African population is 35.8%, and this is far higher than the national average of 31.9%. That goes into our last graphic, our third slide, which particularly looks at the unemployment rate. Unemployment rate, quarter 4, 2024, unemployment rate. White South Africans are at 6.7% unemployment within the country, at a national average of 31.9%. So out of the national average of 31.9%, only 6.7% white South Africans are unemployed. I wonder what genocide people are speaking about. When you go and you compare to the black African, the national average is 31.9%, but black South Africans are at a higher rate when it comes to unemployment than the national average. It is at 35.8%. Then you go to the Indian Asian community. It is sitting at 14% out of the 31.9% of the national average. Then the colored community, largely dejected, by the way, when you look at their areas where they live in, not just, by the way, in Gauteng, in KwaZulu-Natal, in the Northern Cape, but also in the Western Cape. If you look at the type of areas that the colored community lives in, they are at 22.3% out of the national average of 31.9%. But the startling issue of the black majority, their unemployment level is at a higher level than the national average of 31.9%. The black Africans are unemployed. Unemployment rate is sitting at 35.8%, Bongiwe, and that just wonders if AfriForum and those who come from Orania, as they crisscross the United States of America, talking with whoever, Elon Musk, Donald Trump, look at the land ownership within the country. We did that a few weeks ago, largely in the hands of the white minority who currently control and have title, by the way, to those particular farms. They may say it is not on an individual basis, as Peter du Toit, but not the journalist, but it may also be that that title may be in a trust that is owned by the Van der Merwe family, for an example, as opposed to the tiny 1% that may be owned by the Masego Family Trust, that owns a nice piece of land but is not at the heart of Stellenbosch or the Western Cape, or large agrarian land that produces products that can be exported to the external and the international markets.
Samgele, some startling numbers there that you've really just painted for us, certainly. Thank you very much for just giving us a sense of how things are looking, especially when it comes to this thorny subject, as we've seen it, and then some of the numbers being bandied about on social media. So that is how we wrap up, in fact, this week's edition of Explain and Verify. Hopefully, you now have a better sense of how things are looking.